In my neighborhood, there's an unwritten rule that should already be posted at the entrance to the condominium. Don't stop, don't sit, don't breathe without looking useful. And if there's one thing my father has mastered, it's the art of not looking useful when he's relaxing. The man is a legend at sitting still. He seems to have been born for it. Retired, with a cap on his head, a folded newspaper on his lap, and a mug of coffee that he never finishes, just warms his hand while he stares at nothing. It's almost a sculpture of tranquility with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. But tranquility, in this neighborhood, is seen as provocation. The morning it all blew up, he was just like that. Front seat, legs crossed, Saturday newspaper, cap down. Total silence, except for the noise of a bird out of tune and the sound of the sprinklers in the front garden. Everything was normal, until she appeared. The woman appeared as she always does, walking as if she had the remote control of the universe in her hands, bag slung over her shoulder as a shield, clipboard under her arm as if it were a Bible, and that look of someone who has already judged, condemned, and only has to announce the sentence. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, looked at my father as if she had seen a criminal warming up the engine to get away, and stood there for a while, as if waiting for him to confess. My father didn't even notice, or pretended not to, which is more likely. He knows the type. He's seen people like this in real uniform, trying to pretend to be authoritative where they're not. But that day, she was determined to put on a show. The woman took her cell phone out of her pocket, made a quick call, and started writing something down on her clipboard. Then she turned around and marched off. Apparently, someone standing on a bench was now formal complaint material. About 15 minutes later, the absurd parked on our sidewalk, a golf cart painted in the colors of the HOA. Yes, the association now had its own vehicle, and 2 community order officers got out of it. You could see that they had been handpicked in terms of theatricality. One was wearing a vest that looked more like a fisherman's vest, with too many pockets and not enough authority. The other wore sunglasses even without the sun, and held an unplugged walkie-talkie, just to pose. The 2 approached with the confidence of someone who thinks they're taking part in a serious documentary. One of them announced in a projected voice, "We've received a report of unproductive behavior in a public area. We ask for your identification." My father didn't even move. He lifted his cap a little, looked over the newspaper and said, "I'm in front of my house." The second man replied, without blinking, "According to HOA regulations, you have to justify staying in spaces with continuous visibility." Continuous visibility. I almost choked on my coffee. They were saying that my father was disturbing the visual landscape of the neighborhood because he was sitting down. But it didn't end there. One of them approached me and, with a gesture worthy of a bad cop movie, took out of his pocket a pair of plastic handcuffs, the kind used to attach wire or, at most, to hold a tree branch. He tried to touch my father's shoulder, saying that he was being detained for loitering in a security zone. The woman, of course, reappeared out of nowhere, cell phone in hand, filming everything with that rotten little smile of someone who thinks they've won. She even said to the camera, "Here's the individual in suspicious activity, defying the structure of community order." That's when my father got up, slowly, no hurry. He put the newspaper away, tapped his cap twice on his leg, and took out a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He opened it with one hand. Inside, his badge. Sheriff, not ex-cop, not retired, not an extra. Acting sheriff, with authority over the entire length of the county. The kind of authority that makes real police stop their cars when they pass by. In the silence that fell, you could hear the grass growing. One of the officers stumbled backwards, and the other started sweating so hard that his glasses slipped off his nose. The woman stammered something about internal procedures and tried to end the recording as if it were an innocent mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was overbearing. The next morning started with an email. Not one of those lukewarm condo update emails, but a true manifesto of insanity. Subject: urgent, subversive activity by unregistered authority. The message, written in Comic Sans font, which should be a crime in itself, detailed the invasion of community patrol functions by an individual wearing illegitimate insignia. In other words, they were insinuating that my father's badge was a fake. They decided to question the legitimacy of the county sheriff. The text was signed by her, of course. The woman couldn't just accept that she had lost. When faced with someone who had real authority, she decided that it was the authority that should be investigated. In her mind, the neighborhood association was above the state. HOA greater than Constitution. For the rest of the day, the street became a pathetic parade of attempts to reassert power. The community agents reappeared in new uniforms, now with lemon-yellow vests, hats with the association's logo embroidered on them, and a tablet on which they wrote down infractions of passive behavior in active zones. In other words, anyone standing where they thought they couldn't was targeted. An 82-year-old man was stopped because he spent too long watering his plants. A girl was warned for sitting on the sidewalk with a scattered look on her face. A boy on a bicycle was verbally reprimanded for stopping to drink water while leaning against a tree. They were freaking out. They created a control system based on delusions of surveillance. My father, of course, pretended not to see. He continued with his usual routine. Morning walk, strategic stop in the front seat, newspaper in hand, and the tranquility of someone who knows exactly who they are. Only now, he made a point of leaving his badge hanging around his neck, like a war necklace. And every time he passed, the guards looked away. The most hilarious thing was when one of them, the one with the sunglasses, decided to try again. Alone this time. He waited for my father to move away from the house and approached him with a clipboard in his hand, shaking more than a fishing rod. He said, in a tone that was a mixture of anger and panic, "We're going to file a formal complaint about this visual intimidation." My father replied without raising his voice, "Do you want to file this with the city battalion? I can take you there." The man turned pale. He thanked me and left like someone who sees death and decides he prefers life. But while the little condominium soldiers began to retreat, she, the generalissima of chaos, doubled down. She had signs installed around the neighborhood, real signs made of metal with screws and everything. They read, IMPRODUCTIVEOBSERVATIONFREEZONE. Others had messages such as, "Sitting here generates warning," or "Exclusive space for transit with purpose." The signs started appearing out of nowhere. One in the playground, another near the post office, two in front of my house. It looked like a dystopia sponsored by Home Depot, and no one knew who was authorizing it. HOA meetings began to be held in secret. Some residents began to revolt. A lady from another block tore a sign down the middle and planted a daisy on top. That's when the woman went berserk. She posted a video in the neighborhood group, that group where people usually just send pictures of raccoons on the roof, saying that the strange element was setting up a regime of intimidation against the established order. She didn't mention my father directly, but showed a photo of him sitting on the bench with a red circle around him, as if he were an escaped criminal. It escalated. On Saturday, she organized a walk for community discipline. He handed out vests, flyers, and called on residents to reconquer public spaces for visual productivity. Fewer than 10 people showed up. Among them, the guy who sells homemade truffles and a lady who mistakes my dog for her grandson. Even so, they marched out, whistling, filming, trying to record anyone who was in prolonged rest. They passed in front of my house. My father was on the bench, of course, this time with a book, because he'd already read the Saturday paper. The woman stopped, pointed at her cell phone, and began to give a speech. This kind of attitude affects the sense of collective vigilance. We need to act. We need to restore the spirit of the HOA. My father didn't even raise his head. He just turned the page. One of the neighbors recorded the whole thing. The video went viral. Title, "Man Reads Book While Garden Militia Freaks Out." It was shared in groups of residents from all over the state. There were even people saying It was performance art. What she didn't know was that, while she was filming and shouting, the state ombudsman's office had already received the complaint. And the complaint was not a small one. Misrepresentation, attempted obstruction of public authority, use of threatening language, abuse of power, and, of course, installation of public signs without county approval. The signs would only be the beginning of the end. At the beginning of the following week, the signs began to disappear, one by one. No warning, no noise, no announcement. They disappeared in the wee hours of the morning, as if an invisible force was cleaning up the neighborhood's authoritarian mess. Some residents said they saw a town hall truck driving slowly through the night. Others swear that it was the sheriff himself who organized the silent cleanup. The truth? Nobody knows. But the signs are gone, and with them, the woman's facade of power also began to crack. She tried to resist. She issued an official statement by email. She called it an act of vandalism coordinated by undercover agents. She said the community was under attack. He even tried to schedule an emergency HOA meeting to discuss retaliatory measures. Only no one showed up, not a single chair occupied, not even the faithful volunteers of the Visual Discipline Patrol. That troop of idlers with whistles and tablets vanished like smoke. From then on, she began to walk differently. It was no longer that firm stride of someone who thinks she's running a country. It was a short, tight gait, with her chin slightly tucked in, like someone who knows she's lost, but still pretends she can recover. She avoided looking in front of my house. She avoided crossing paths with my father. She crossed the street when she saw him coming. Even so, she tried to maintain her pose. A bigger bag, a more starched blazer, prescription glasses that probably didn't even need lenses, just looks. But the reality was that her name was already on the county prosecutor's desk. The complaints made by residents, with videos, prints, statements, had been transformed into an official report. The accusations ranged from abuse of authority to misuse of association funds to print educational material. One of the strongest points was the attempted arrest of the sheriff, a move so dumb that it could only have come from that head. The fake policeman didn't escape either. One of them had already left town. The other, the one with the plastic handcuffs, was called to testify. He said that he acted under the guidance of the HOA leadership and that he didn't know that wearing a fake badge was a crime. He tried to say that it was just a symbolic activity. But he didn't convince anyone. In the neighborhood, the mood changed completely. The street, previously suffocated by idiotic rules, began to breathe. People went back to watering their plants in peace, sitting on the sidewalk without fear of judgment, chatting at the gate without worrying about the active visibility zone. It was as if the neighborhood had come out of a collective cult. The feeling of freedom was almost absurd. One resident started walking around with a beach chair, just to sit in random places. Another created an open-air reading group, just for provocation. My father was invited to be an honorary patron of the Citizen Leisure Club. He refused, of course, but laughed like he hadn't in a long time. On Friday, the bomb dropped. The woman received a direct notification from the county. She had to go to the administrative headquarters to answer the charges. There was no more pretending. It was no longer possible to say it was just a neighborly disagreement. It was serious. The local media got wind of it. A journalist appeared on the street. He took pictures of her house. He tried to interview her. She didn't come out. She locked the door, closed the windows, and turned off the Wi-Fi. At the police station, my father commented to a colleague, "She thought she was in charge of everything. She discovered that, in the end, she doesn't even have real authority over her own gate." The comment went around the city. It became a meme, a T-shirt. People took it seriously. On Saturday, someone made a banner and tied it between two posts near the HOA headquarters. It read, "Aesthetic Autocracy Free Zone." On Sunday, the woman left the house, for the first time in weeks. No clipboard, no blazer, no pose. She was wearing an ordinary T-shirt and sweatpants. She looked around, passed in front of the bank where it all began. The bank that now had a new sign put up by the locals, reserved for the sheriff, guardian of good sense. She stopped. She looked at the sign for a few seconds. Then she left. The following Monday, the county officials arrived in a small truck. They collected documents, an old computer, and a printer. The HOA headquarters was sealed for administrative review. That day, my father left early from his walk. He sat on the bench. He had his coffee. He read the newspaper. After a while, he looked in my direction and said, "It took a while, but now you can even hear the birds again." He was right. The neighborhood had finally found the right kind of silence, the kind that doesn't come from imposition, but from peace. In the last week of that infernal summer, the whole neighborhood seemed to breathe differently. The breeze that passed between the houses no longer smelled of the HOA's laminated paper, nor did it have the unbearable sound of the whistles of the peace officers. It was real air, with the sound of lawn mowers, people laughing in the yard, and dogs barking without fear of being fined for excessive canine communication. Her reign, which once seemed unshakable, was now just an embarrassing reminder of how ridiculous misallocated power can make people look. The HOA headquarters remained closed. The windows were covered with newspaper, as if the building was in mourning. The association's WhatsApp group, once teeming with notifications, now only received useless self-help chains and videos of elderly people dancing on Japanese programs. Silence, ironically, was the neighborhood's new victory cry. My father continued with his sacred routine. Fresh coffee, newspaper on his lap, bench in front of the house. But now, every morning, a different neighbor stopped by to say hello. Some stayed to chat. Others sat next to them, as if that piece of sidewalk had become a temple of resistance, a place where madness was exorcised with patience, coffee, and a badge in your pocket. The woman, after the notification from the county and the repercussions that took on almost comical proportions, disappeared. She didn't leave the house for days. When she finally showed up, she was wearing a huge hat, famous grandmother's sunglasses, and a posture of someone who still wanted to appear in control of something, even if it was only her own shame. She discreetly tried to show up at neighborhood events. She went to a garage fair pretending that nothing had happened. She stopped at the children's lemonade stand, smiled crookedly, said something about good times. The children didn't respond. The father of one of them grabbed the glass out of her hand before it touched his lips. Everyone watched. No one commented. It was more humiliating than any official punishment. After that, invitations to hearings started arriving from the town hall. An administrative process was opened to assess whether she could continue to exercise any function in civil associations. The history of conduct went beyond the issue of aesthetic abuse. There was also intimidation of residents, use of falsified visual identity, attempts to impose rules without a vote, and that disgusting icing on the cake, trying to handcuff the county sheriff for loitering. The final investigation report was practically a bad soap opera with a bad movie script. There were screenshots of her referring to the residents as a disorganized mass in need of visual direction, messages directing the fake cops to act tough even without official backing, and a detailed plan for zoning in on appropriate behavior. It was a dictatorship of grass and sidewalk, written with colored marker on Excel spreadsheets. She tried to defend herself. She sent open letters, recorded videos talking about misunderstanding the community mission, claimed she was fighting for visual peace and sound harmony. But it was too late. People weren't buying it anymore. The woman who had once been seen as a neighborhood organizer was now just a joke that no one wanted to repeat. At the end of the month, the verdict came out. Banned from working in any civil organization with an administrative function for an indefinite period. She couldn't even lead a gardening group without prior authorization from the town hall. Her face was removed from the mural at the entrance to the neighborhood. The nameplate at the HOA headquarters was removed. The position was dissolved. The headquarters restructured by a new team, chosen by direct vote of the residents, in an election that had more participation than the last municipal one. And on the day of the new management's official changeover, my father was invited as a guest of honor. He refused, of course. He preferred the bench, the morning shade, and the sound of the birds. But he left a message. If the community wants peace, it needs to learn to recognize when someone just wants to show off. The paper was read out at the event as if it were a presidential speech. The woman? She still lives in the same house, with the windows always closed, the grass a little too high, the gate locked with 2 chains. Every now and then someone sees her through the gap in the curtain, watching the street like someone surveying a territory they've lost. Alone, no clipboard, no whistle, no army, just her and the bitter memory that she tried to command more than she could, and ended up being swallowed up by her own thirst for control. In the end, the neighborhood wasn't perfect. It still has its problems, raids, noisy dogs, and screaming children. But now, at least, no one will end up in a plastic chair for sitting too much. Because sometimes, the greatest gesture of resistance is exactly that. Sitting down, breathing, watching time go by. And let the world know that common sense still exists, with or without a badge in your pocket. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.